So over the years, there's been a lot of discussion about archetypes. But what exactly is an archetype? Well, today we're going to take a break from dreams and we're going to get into it. So when I say archetype, I have something specific in mind. And unfortunately, the term is used in a lot of different contexts, and it can be very confusing for people trying to make sense of it. The context I'm using the term today is in psychology, and it's the archetype as described by Carl Jung in his analytical psychology. There are examples of the term archetype being used in, say, literary criticism of Northrop Frye, for example, or in the comparative mythology and religion of Mircea Eliade. But when those guys use the term archetype, or say Joseph Campbell uses the term archetype, they don't mean exactly the same thing that Jung did. So let's be clear about this. So oftentimes the archetype is associated with a cross-culturally appearing motif, say that of the sun god, or a Beauty and the Beast type story. We're going to get into some examples here today. But for Jung, he decided that that wasn't quite enough for him, because the cross-culturally appearing motif and the fact that around the world people tend to tell the same kinds of stories and have the same sorts of symbolic associations and images has kind of gone unexplained, really. There's been a lot of debate about exactly why that is, but Jung felt like he had the answer, and that was that the psyche, the human mind, has just an innate tendency to tell certain stories a certain way. We tend, just a matter of being a member of Homo sapiens, we tell certain kinds of stories, and we create the same kind of images and symbols, just as a matter of our species history. Unfortunately, at the time, he didn't have a whole lot of evidence and means, really, to prove that exactly, other than to just look at the way that things are symbolized throughout history cross-culturally, and then connect that to his psychotherapy patients and their dream content. One of his most famous examples, many of his examples involved describing a particular motif that has appeared cross-culturally and showing how a patient of his had the same kind of symbolism in their dreams. So that was his primary means of explaining what it was. And so what he did then was he differentiated between the archetypal image and what he called the archetype as such. So this is a little confusing, but mainly the difference is that the archetype as such is the actual thing that we inherit. He wasn't able to really characterize it that well, because at the time there wasn't a whole lot known about the brain or about evolution or neuroscience or any of that. So he had to speculate, and he said that there's some inherited factor that we get that makes us tend to want to tell the kinds of stories that you see repeated over and over again. The archetypal image is the end result of that, and they can vary quite a bit. But the basic structure of the archetypal image, say, if you have a sun deity, it will more often than not have these particular kinds of features. So the example of a sun god in one culture versus another, they're going to be different from each other, but they're going to have the same underlying structure to them. And so the structure, or the form without content, is the way he phrased it, is the archetype as such. Okay, so let's give an example. So we've all heard the story about King Arthur and how he got the magic sword from the Lady in the Lake, and then he used it to unite the lands in a series of battles. But what you may not know is that that is a version of a commonly repeated folktale motif. Folklorists classify that as the gift of the demon's tale, the ASU type 611, for anyone interested. There's examples of that motif of a leader getting a magic sword from water deities to use subsequently to conquer the surrounding enemies. Now that seems like it's pretty specific, but surprisingly enough, it does appear over and over again. There's examples found in Finland, in Livonia, in Latvia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Ireland. There's examples in Germany, Greece, Poland, China, and among the Yakuts. Okay, I could go on and on with these sometimes. There are just so many different examples of these. So that's an example of the kind of thing that would fascinate Jung. He would look at that and go, well, there must be some kind of archetypal process, right? The archetype as such, that's something that we inherit that makes that kind of story a little bit easier to not only produce spontaneously, even if you've never heard of anything like that, but then once you hear it, you're going to want to repeat it, right? There's a fascination to it. There's something that clicks in the human mind. Okay, here's another one. The sun. We talked about sun gods earlier, and I'm going to do a future video on the sun god specifically, and break it down. But just in general, oftentimes when you see a deity that is associated with the sun for whatever reason, it tends to be the supreme deity. Oftentimes it is associated with creation or life itself. It's very commonly associated with knowledge, with safety, with unity, with perfection. And you can see examples of this ranging as far as the Amaterasu from the Japanese mythology, to the Sol Invictus, or the invincible sun of ancient Romans, to Tawa of the Hopi Native American tribe. All of these far-ranging examples, the deity seems to have the same kind of qualities to it. Well, what's up with that? So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here, though. So if you get right down to what Jung's specific definition of an archetype is, one of the problems you run into is that his definition kind of changed over the years. But without getting too much in the weeds with that, let's just go with the simplest explanation. So the simplest definition he gave was relatively late in his career. And it was basically that the archetype is the inherited tendency that we have to create the kinds of symbols that you see repeated around the world. So more specifically, it is an innate quality of the mind. It doesn't require any specific cultural instruction or learning. So if you were to say take a group of people at birth and move them to Mars and completely separate them from any sort of media and don't allow them to have any exposure, archetype theory would predict that those people would eventually start coming up with sun gods and magic swords out of lakes stories on their own, Beauty and the Beast stories, or Smith and the Devil type stories, because the tendency is innate. There's more to it, though. So from the psychological point of view, it's one thing to say that we have a tendency to tell these kind of stories, but Jung went further than that, quite a bit further. He also thought that these kind of stories tended to emerge during emotionally turbulent times in our lives. That for whatever reason, the emotions tie into those kind of instinctive, innate parts of the psyche. And that's when the imagination would be more likely to produce an archetypal image of some kind that had something to do with your particular situation. I have encountered, say, for example, at one conference I went to, there was a description of a patient who was going through a very turbulent time in his life. He'd had a history of abuse, and had some very great difficulties at that time. And at the key moment in his development, he had a vision, a spontaneous vision that sort of popped up in his mind of a baby being stepped on by a boot. But despite the pressure applied by the boot, which was crushing the baby survived and used its rage to heal itself. So, looking at that is an archetypal image, and it's one of the divine child that Jung describes, a pattern of motifs where there's a child, has a divine origin, it's put in peril, it's put under severe stress, but because of its nature is able to survive and thrive anyway, despite that. So that's an example of what we're talking about here. There's many others out there. Now, the thing about archetypal images then, because they have this innate core, they do have a stable meaning to them. Now, you have to say that with some caution, though. That doesn't mean that every archetype means exactly the same thing. It means that they're all created from the same raw material, but each individual person has that. If they experience an archetypal image in a dream or a vision or just spontaneous creative activity that has a largely unconscious origin to it, then you can work your way towards what it means because it has these common elements in it. But it doesn't mean that every person's, sun god is the same. That's not the case. They're not identical. They just have common features to them that you can work out. So there's an element to them that is individual and personal, and there's an element to them that is innate and impersonal. And sometimes very tough to untangle those. But as we go in this channel, we'll get into some ways that you can do that. So to recap then, an archetypal image is one that an individual person may produce on their own, or one that you might see repeated throughout a particular culture. But the archetype as such is the innate human component of the psyche that has a strong pull to create that kind of image. So that's how you can tell the difference, and that's what, in psychology anyway, what an archetype is.